Hello, this is Book Club, and we're reading A Story of a Vet, and we're on chapter 10. But before we do chapter 10, I gave you some questions about chapter 9. So how did you get on with those? Remember, James had been to the Darrowby Fair, the show, Darrowby show, and James had some duties as the vet. He wasn't having a very good time of it, was he? So, first question was, when James first comes out of the beer tent, he watches a sport he'd never seen before. He says, "This is a sport I've never seen before in any other part of the country." And he was watching farmhands, the farmers, hurling a straw bale over a bar. So that's the sort of thing farmers used to get up to and compete against each other. Don't know what they called it. Straw bale hurling, probably. Okay, so second question. Do you remember there were two birds when James was judging the pets? He had a terrible time with that. It's very funny. And there was two birds that were talking. And what kind of bird was saying hello in a very posh voice? And that was a parrot. Okay, so there's a parrot. And then the third question, what kind of bird was saying, "Shut the door as you go out," in the Yorkshire accent? And that was a myna bird. Okay, so well done if you got any of those right. So let's do chapter 10. Ben Ashby, the cattle dealer, looked over the gate with his habitual deadpan expression. It always seemed to me that after a lifetime of buying cows from farmers, he had developed a terror of showing any emotion which might be interpreted as enthusiasm. When he looked at a beast, his face registered nothing beyond occasionally a gentle sorrow. This was how it was this morning, as he leaned over the top of the gate and directed a gloomy stare at Harry Sumner's heifer. After a few moments he turned to the farmer. "I wish you'd had her in for me, Harry. She's too far away. I'm going to have to go get over the top." He began to climb stiffly upwards, and it was then that he spotted Monty. The bull hadn't been so easy to see before as he cropped the grass among the group of heifers, but suddenly the great head rose high above the others. The nose ring gleamed, and an ominous strangled bellow sounded across the grass. And he gazed at us as he pulled absently at the turf with a forefoot. Ben Ashby stopped climbing, hesitated for a second, then returned to ground level. "Aye, well," he muttered, still without changing expression. It's not that far away. I reckon I can see all right from here." Monty had changed a lot since the first day I saw him about 2 years ago. He'd been a fortnight old then, a skinny, knock-kneed little creature, his head deep in a calf bucket. "Well, what do you think of my new bull?" Harry Sumner had asked, laughing. "Not much for 100 quid, is he?" I whistled. "As much as that?" "Aye, it's a lot for a new dropped calf, isn't it? But I can't think of any other way of getting into the Newton strain. I haven't the money to buy a big un." Harry was a bright boy. He had inherited a little place of about 100 acres on his father's death, and with his young wife had set about making it go. He was in his early 20s when I first saw him. I had been deceived by his almost delicate appearance into thinking that he wouldn't be up to the job. The pale face, the large sensitive eyes and slender frame didn't seem fitted for the 7 days a week, milking, feeding, mucking out slog that was dairy farming. But I had been wrong. The fearless way he plunged in and grabbed at the hind feet of kicking cows for me to examine, and his clenched teeth determination as he hung on to the noses of the big loose beasts at testing time, made me change my mind in a hurry. He worked endlessly and tirelessly, and it was natural that his drive should have taken him to the south of Scotland to find a bull. Harry's was an Ayrshire herd, unusual among the almost universal shorthorns in the Dales, and there was no doubt an injection of the famous Newton blood would be a sure way of improving his stock. He's got prize winners on both his sire and dam's side, the young farmer said, and a grand pedigree name too, Newton Montmorency VI, Monty for short. As though recognising his name, the calf raised his head from the bucket and looked at us. It was a comic little face, wet-muzzled, milk slobbered halfway up to his cheeks and dribbling freely from his mouth. I bent over into the pen and scratched the top of the hard little head, feeling the tiny horn buds no bigger than peas under my fingers. Limpid-eyed and unafraid, Monty submitted calmly to the caress for a few moments, then sank his head again in the bucket. I saw quite a bit of Harry Sumner over the next few weeks, and usually he had a look at his expensive purchase. And as the calf grew, you could see why he had cost £100. He was in a pen with 3 of Harry's own calves, and his superiority was evident at a glance. The broad forehead and wide-set eyes, the deep chest and short, straight legs, and beautiful, even line of the back from shoulder to tail head. Monty had class, and small as he was all bull. He was about 3 months old when Harry rang to say he thought the calf had pneumonia. I was surprised because the weather was fine and warm, and I knew Monty was in a draft-free building. But when I saw him, I thought immediately that his owner's diagnosis was right. The heaving of the rib cage, the temperature of 105 degrees. It looked fairly straightforward. But when I got my stethoscope on his chest and listened for pneumonic sounds, I heard nothing. Sorry about that. But when I got my I heard nothing. His lungs were perfectly clear. I went over to him several times, but there was not a squeak, not a riffle, not the slightest sign of consolidation. This was a puzzle. I turned to the farmer. It's a funny one, Harry. He's sick all right, but his symptoms don't add to anything recognisable. I was going against my early training because the first vet I ever saw in practice with in my student days told me once, "If you don't know what's wrong with an animal, for God's sake, don't admit it. Give it a name with an animal, for God's sake. Give it a name called McCluskey's disease or galloping dandruff, anything you like, but give it a name." But I couldn't think of anything. As I looked at the panting, anxious-eyed little creature. Treat the symptoms, that was a thing to do. He had a temperature, so I tried to get that down for a start. On the 4th morning, Harry Sumner met me as I got out of the car. "He's walking funny this morning, Mr. Herriot, and he seems to be blind." Blind? An unusual form of lead poisoning? Could that be it? I hurried into the calf pen and began to look around the walls, but there wasn't a scrap of paint anywhere, and Monty had spent his entire life in there. And anyway, as I looked at him, I realised that he wasn't really blind. His eyes were staring and slightly upturned, and he blundered unseeingly around the pen. But he blinked as I passed my hand in front of his face. To complete my bewilderment, He walked with a wooden, stiff-legged gait, almost like a mechanical toy. My mind began to snatch at diagnostic straws. Tetanus? No. Meningitis? No. No, I always tried to maintain the calm, professional exterior, but inside I had to fight an impulse to scratch my head and stand gaping. I left as soon as possible and settled down to serious thought as I drove away. That night I got out my books, notes from college, back numbers of the Veterinary Record, that's a magazine, and anything. It's my daughter keep ringing. Sorry about that. And anything else I could find on the subject of calf diseases. Somewhere here there would surely be a clue. But the volumes on medicine and surgery were barren of inspiration, and I had about given up hope when I came upon the passage in a little pamphlet on calf diseases. Peculiar stilted gait, staring eyes with a tendency to gaze upwards, occasionally respiratory symptoms with high temperature. The words seemed to leap out at me from the printed page, and it was as though the unknown author was patting me on the shoulder and murmuring reassuringly, "This is it, you see, it's all perfectly clear." I grabbed the phone and rang Harry Sumner. "Harry, have you ever noticed Monty and those other calves in the pen licking each other?" "Aye, they're always at it, the little beggars. It's like an hobby with them. Why?" "I know what's wrong with your bull. He's got a hairball." "A hairball? Where?" "It's in the fourth stomach. That's what's setting up all those strange symptoms." "Well, what are we going to do about it then?" "Well, it will mean an operation, but I'd like to give it a go." So, the next day, as I saw Harry, "He hasn't had a bite now for 3 days, Harry said. "I doubt it won't stick it much longer." I looked from his worried face to the little animal trembling in the pen. "You're right. We'll have to open him up straight away to have any hope of saving him. Are you willing to let me have a go?" "All right, let's be at job. Sooner the better." He smiled at me. It was a confident smile, and my stomach gave a lurch. But this young farmer had faith in me. He thought I could do the job, so it was no good letting him see my doubt. Harry and I busied ourselves in boiling up the instruments, setting out buckets of hot water, and laying a clean bed of straw in an empty pen. Despite his weakness, the calf took nearly 60 cc's of Nembutal into his vein before he was fully anaesthetised. But finally he was asleep, propped on his back between 2 straw bales, his little hooves dangling above him. I was ready to start. It's never the same as it is in the books. The pictures and diagrams look so simple and straightforward, but it is a different thing in reality. I incised the stomach and had my first look at the cause of the trouble. It wasn't a ball at all, rather a flat plaque of densely matted hair, mixed freely with strands of hay, sour curd, and a shining covering of my liquid paraffin. Gingerly I drew it out through the incision and dropped it in the straw. It wasn't till I'd closed the stomach wound with gut, stitching up the muscle there, and had started on the skin, that I realised that the sweat was running down my face. As I blew away a droplet from my nose end, Harry broke the silence. "It's a hell of a tricky job, isn't it?" he said. Then he laughed and thumped my shoulder. "I bet you felt a bit queer the first time you did one of these." I pulled another strand of suture silk through and knotted it. "You're right, Harry. How right you are." When I had finished, we covered Monty with a horse rug and piled straw on top of that, leaving only his head sticking out. I bent over and touched a corner of the eye. Not a vestige of corneal reflex. God, he was deep. And had I given him too much anaesthetic? And of course, there'd be surgical shock too. As I left, I glanced back at the motionless little animal. He looked smaller than ever and very vulnerable under the bare walls of the pen. I was busy for the rest of the day, but that evening my thoughts kept coming back to Monty. Had he come out of it yet? Maybe he was dead. I hadn't the experience of previous cases to guide me, and I simply had no idea of how a calf reacted to an operation like that, and I couldn't rid myself of the nagging consciousness of how much it all meant to Harry. Next morning, when I went to see Harry, Monty was sitting up on his chest. He was still under the rug and straw, and he looked sorry for himself, but when a bovine animal is on his chest, I always feel hopeful. The tension flowed from me in a great wave. He had survived the operation. The first stage was over, and as I knelt, rubbing the top of his head, I had the feeling that we were going to win. And in fact, he did get better. I was delighted. Like a teacher with his favourite pupil, I developed a warm affection for the calf, and whenever I was on the farm, he always walked up to me and regarded me with friendly interest. It was as if he had fellow feeling for me too. He was rather more than a year old when I noticed the change. The friendly interest gradually disappeared from his eyes and was replaced by a thoughtful, speculative look, and he developed a habit of shaking his head at me at the same time. "I'd stop going in there, Mr. Elliot, if I were you," Harry said one day. "He's getting big, and I reckon he's going to be a cheeky bugger before he's finished." But cheeky was the wrong word. Harry had a long, trouble-free spell, and Monty was nearly 2 years old when I saw him again. It wasn't a case of illness this time. 1 or 2 of Harry's cows had been calving before their time, and it was typical of him that he should ask me to test his entire herd for brucellosis. We worked our way easily through the cows, and I had a long row of glass tubes filled with blood in just over an hour. "Well, that's the lot in there," the farmer said. "We'll only have to have Bull to do when we're finished." He led the way across the yard, through the door into the calf pens, and along a passage to the bull box at the end. He opened the half door, and as I looked inside, I felt a sudden sense of shock. Monty was enormous. The neck, with its jutting humps of muscle, supported a head so huge that the eyes looked tiny. And there was nothing friendly in those eyes now. No expression at all, in fact, only a cold, black glitter. He was standing sideways to me, facing the wall, but I knew he was watching me as he pushed his head against the stones, his great horns scouring the white wash with slow, menacing deliberation. Occasionally he snorted from deep in his chest, but apart from that he remained completely still. Monty wasn't just a bull, he was a vast, brooding presence. Harry grinned as he saw me staring over the door. "Well, do you fancy popping inside to scratch his head? That's what you always used to do." No thanks." I dragged my eyes away from the animal. But I wondered what my expectation of life would be if I did go in. "I reckon he'd last about a minute," Harry said thoughtfully. "He's a grand bull, all I ever expected, but by God he's a mean 'un. I never trust him an inch." "And how," I asked without enthusiasm, "am I supposed to get a sample of blood from him?" "Oh, well, I'll trap his head in yon corner." Harry pointed to a metal yoke above a trough in an opening into the yard at the far side of the box. "I'll give him some meal to entice him in." He went back down the passage, and soon I could see him out in the yard scooping meal into the trough. The bull at first took no notice and continued to prod at the wall with his horns. Then he turned with awesome slowness, took a few unhurried steps across the box, and put his nose down to the trough. Harry, out of sight in the yard, pulled the lever and the yoke crashed shut on the great neck. "All right, the farmer cried, hanging on to the lever. I have him. You can go in now. I opened the door and entered the box, and though the bull was held fast by the head, there was still the uneasy awareness that he and I were alone in that small space together, and as I passed along the massive body and put my hand on the neck, I sensed a quivering emanation of pent-up power and rage. Everything was quiet, and then everything started to happen. The bull gave a tremendous bellow and whipped round at me with no trace of his former lethargy. I saw that he'd got one horn out of the yoke, and though he couldn't reach me with his head, his shoulder knocked me on my back with a terrifying revelation of unbelievable strength. I heard Harry shouting from outside, and as I scrambled up and headed for the box door, I saw that the madly plunging creature had almost got his second horn clear, and when I reached the passage, I heard the clang of the yoke as he finally freed himself. Anybody who has travelled a narrow passage a few feet ahead of about a ton of snorting, pounding death would appreciate that I didn't dawdle. I was spurred on by the certain knowledge that if Monty caught me, he would plaster me against the wall as effortlessly as I would squash a ripe plum. And though I was clad in a long oilskin coat and Wellingtons, I doubt whether an Olympic sprinter in full running kit would have bettered my time. I made the door at the end with a foot to spare, dived through and crashed it shut. The first thing I saw was Harry Sumner running round from the outside of the box. He was very pale. I couldn't see my face, but I felt pale. Even my lips were cold and numb. God, I'm sorry, Harry said hoarsely. The yoke couldn't have closed properly. That bloody great neck of his. The lever just jerked out of my hand. Damn, I'm glad to see you. I thought you were a goner. I looked down at my hand. The blood-filled syringe was still tightly clutched there. Well, I got my sample anyway, Harry, and it's just as well because it would take some fast talking to get me in there to try another. I'm afraid you've just seen the end of a beautiful friendship. Ah, the big sod. Harry listened for a moment to the thudding of Monty's horns against the door. And after all you did for him, that's gratitude for you. Whew, James only just got out of that in one piece, didn't he? So, questions. Right back to the beginning. Question number 1. How much did Monty the bull cost? So his little calf, and Harry Sumner bought him. It's a lot of money for Harry. So see if you can remember how much he cost. And then, what was the matter with Monty? Do you remember when James couldn't work out what was the matter with him? He thought it was pneumonia and it wasn't. And then suddenly he thought, I know what it is. So see if you can remember what that was. And then, why did James run out of Monty's stall at the end when Monty's all grown up and huge? What does he think would have happened if he'd stayed in the stall with the bull? Okay, so enjoy having a go at those questions, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.